Have you ever been, like, sitting right in the middle of a blazing argument?
Oh, we've all been there.
Right, completely stuck, and someone tells you to, I don't know, just communicate openly or set boundaries.
Yeah, the classic advice.
Exactly, and you're sitting there, your blood pressure is just spiking, and you're thinking that advice is completely, entirely useless in the heat of the moment.
Because it usually is.
Right. So today, we're going to reveal exactly why that generic advice is structurally flawed. Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today, we are exploring the mechanical, hidden architecture of human relationships.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
It really is. We are pulling from a brilliant analytical essay called The Implicit Treaty, and our mission for this deep dive is to, well, completely discard the vague endpoint labels of traditional relationship advice.
Right, getting rid of the fluff.
Exactly. We want to uncover the actual mechanisms, these invisible constitutions that dictate how we interact, why we collide, and, most importantly, how we can structurally repair those collisions.
It's a really critical shift in perspective, honestly. Because, we're so used to analyzing our relationships through this lens of morality or character.
Oh, for sure. Like, they did this because they're selfish.
Exactly. We look at a miscommunication and think, well, if they cared, they would do this. Or if I was just a better person, I would feel that.
Yeah.
But the source material argues that this moral framing is actually a huge diagnostic error. The problems we face aren't usually character flaws at all. They are constitutional collisions.
Constitutional collisions. I love that phrasing. So, to understand how relationships actually function, we first have to discard the vocabulary that's been failing us.
Right.
The author calls things like communicate openly or be authentic endpoint labels. What exactly does that mean, and why are they an illusion of a solution?
So an endpoint label is basically a phrase that describes a final destination. It describes a state of being, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the path to get there.
Okay, so it's all destination, no map.
Precisely. It gives you the state, but completely strips out the mechanism. Think about that phrase, communicate openly.
Yeah, you hear it everywhere.
Right. When someone who is highly fluent in relational dynamics hears that, they just read it as shorthand. To them, it's a pointer to an entire sequence of operations they already know how to perform unconsciously.
But for everyone else.
For someone who is missing parts of that stack of skills, it is an empty pointer. It's an instruction with the actual machinery completely removed.
I want to break that down because, honestly, it reminds me of terrible business advice.
Oh, how so?
Yeah, telling someone who is failing in a relationship to just communicate openly
Yeah.
is exactly like telling an entrepreneur whose business is tanking to, just run the company well.
Oh, wow. Yes, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. If that founder doesn't know how to read a balance sheet or how to hire against a specific brief or how to negotiate a contract, the advice run the company well is just a tautology dressed up as a plan. It provides zero functional utility.
It really doesn't. And we can actually decompress the phrase, communicate openly, to see what's hiding inside that endpoint label.
Let's do it. What's actually in there?
So to actually do it, especially under the immense emotional load of an argument, you have to execute 8 distinct sequential operations.
8. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. First, you have to notice what actually matters to you in the chaos of your own brain.
Which is hard enough on its own.
Right. Second, you must distinguish a feeling from a belief.
Wait, distinguish a feeling from a belief. Let's pause there. Give me an example of that because, in an argument, everything just feels like an absolute truth.
It is incredibly difficult in the moment. Saying, I feel overwhelmed is a feeling. It's an internal state.
Okay.
But saying, I feel like you don't care about my time is a belief masquerading as a feeling. It's an accusation about the other person's internal state.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I see the difference.
If you can't distinguish the two before you open your mouth, you're going to trigger immediate defensiveness instead of connection.
So that's only step 2. What are the rest?
Third, you have to identify the issue type. Like, are you making a request? Are you stating a boundary? Or are you just making an observation?
Right.
Fourth, you must time the delivery so the other person can actually hear it. Meaning, not springing a heavy conversation on them at midnight when they're exhausted.
Guilty of that one for sure.
We all are. Fifth, you have to phrase it non-defensively. Sixth, tolerate whatever response they produce without entirely losing your own emotional regulation.
That's a huge one.
Seventh, check if the message landed as you intended. And finally, eighth, update your future behavior based on that interaction.
That is a massive cognitive load. I mean, I'm exhausted just listening to that sequence.
It's an 8-operation machine. Every single one of those steps requires its own subskill, and none of that is communicated in the phrase communicate openly.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
The person who already runs the machine produces the output without coaching, but the person who doesn't have the machine cannot bridge that gap just by trying harder or, caring more.
So if generic advice is just pointing at an empty label, what is the actual mechanism running beneath the surface of our interactions?
Right.
Because obviously we are all operating on some kind of logic, even if it's flawed. Which I guess brings us to the core concept of the source text, the implicit treaty.
Exactly. The implicit treaty is this unconscious constitution that each person carries around with them. It dictates exactly what counts as care, respect, honesty, support, and autonomy.
So it's like a personal rule book.
It is the operating default of how reasonable adults are supposed to behave.
Mm.
But the catch is that this treaty is entirely invisible to the person bearing it.
Invisible.
Yeah, it operates perfectly in the background, much like the rules of grammar for a native speaker.
Yeah.
You don't actively think about grammar until someone breaks a rule, and then it just jars you.
Wait, I'm going to push back here for a second.
Mhm.
Aren't there just basic universal human rules for relationships that everyone should naturally know?
Like what?
Like, don't lie, show up when it counts, respect each other's space. It can't all just be subjective, invisible rules, right?
Well, broad human regularities certainly exist at the macro level. Most people agree on the big things. But the micro clauses, the highly specific granular rules that decide concrete day-to-day conflicts, vary wildly from person to person.
Oh, I see.
Treating your own personal treaty as a universal law of human decency is the first major diagnostic error we make.
Because my decency isn't yours.
Exactly. What counts as care to you might feel like overbearing pressure to someone else. What counts as honesty to them might feel like a brutal attack to you.
That is so true.
Each person's treaty is the result of thousands of compressed micro-decisions they've made throughout their life. Both treaties are internally coherent. Both feel completely, objectively obvious from the inside.
And both will inevitably be violated by the other person.
Absolutely inevitable.
So it really only surfaces when it's violated. And when a partner or a colleague breaches this invisible treaty of ours, it feels like a moral failure.
Always feels moral.
We immediately think, oh, they don't care about me, or they're being completely unreasonable. But structurally, what's actually happening is a constitutional collision.
That's the perfect term for it.
It's like downloading a Mac application and trying to run it on a Windows computer. It's not that the Mac app is morally bad or that the Windows computer is broken.
Right, they're just different.
The architecture is just inherently incompatible until you write a translation layer.
That captures the physics of the problem perfectly. It is two different operating systems trying to parse the same data and failing. Neither person is performing poorly on purpose.
They're just reading the encounter through their own constitution.
Exactly, and finding the other person guilty of breach based on their own invisible laws.
So if we're all walking around with these invisible constitutions, the friction must happen when we assume the other person has the exact same rule book.
Which we almost always do.
Right. So what does that actually look like in a daily argument? The source text highlights some very specific collisions. Let's look at a few of those specimens.
We can start with validation versus analysis. This is a common one. Imagine person A's treaty demands presence and what psychologists call co-regulation when they're distressed.
Co-regulation. Meaning what, exactly?
It basically just means their nervous system literally needs another calm nervous system to sync with before their verbal cortex can even process words. They just need you to sit there, be present, and validate the pain.
Oh, right. The classic, I just need you to listen to me, not fix it clause.
Precisely. But person B's treaty, however, views offering analytical repair as the highest possible form of care.
Uh-oh. I see where this is going.
Their constitution says, if you are in distress, I love you, so I'm going to deploy analytical truth to solve the problem so you do not have to hurt anymore.
Wow.
So when these two treaties collide, person A feels abandoned and attacked by the cold analysis. Person B feels rejected and confused because they are offering what their treaty literally defines as love.
It's like person B is handing them a blueprint for a new house while the current house is actively on fire.
Yes, exactly.
Both sides are perfectly logical within their own framework, but the collision is completely tragic. What's another common one?
Solitude is a major one. One treaty views alone time as necessary biological restoration. It is purely energy management. It contains absolutely no commentary on the state of the relationship.
Just literally, my battery is low.
Right, but the opposing treaty defines togetherness. as the basic unit of love. In that constitution, chosen solitude is, by definition, a withdrawal of affection.
Think about the last time you asked for an hour alone and your partner looked completely wounded.
It happens all the time.
The person who needs space says, hey, I need an hour to read, and their partner's internal translator hears, I do not love you, and our relationship is a burden.
And then the partner naturally tries to get closer to fix that perceived distance.
Which makes the first person feel suffocated and retreat further.
It creates a devastating feedback loop. But this dynamic actually leads us to the most dangerous and distinctive collision identified in the text, which is how we handle reasons as real reasons.
Oh, walk us through that mechanism. That sounds fascinating.
In one treaty, a stated reason is taken as literal, explicit self-report. It relies on a concept called epistemic trust,
Epistemic trust.
which basically just means treating someone's words as undeniable data. If I say, I am tired, you believe my literal words, I am just tired.
Okay, straightforward enough.
The opposing treaty, though, views stated reasons not as data, but as social objects. They are maneuvers, face-saving tactics, or polite retrospective justifications to avoid conflict.
Wait, I'm stuck on this one.
How so?
Well, if I ask my partner why they're quiet, and they say, I'm just tired, but I know for a fact they're actually mad about a comment I made at dinner, am I supposed to just take them literally and ignore reality? That feels like playing dumb.
See, this is exactly why the collision is so explosive. You are operating from the treaty where words are a poker game, and you have to guess the hidden motive to understand the truth.
Right.
But what if your partner is operating from the literal treaty? What if they genuinely are just tired? When you keep pushing and asking, no, what's really wrong, they feel violated. Their literal honesty is being viewed as a suspicious social maneuver.
They feel like they're being interrogated.
Yes, interrogated for hidden motives they simply do not possess. Meanwhile, from your side, you feel like taking things literally is an epistemic violation. You think, of course, that's not the real reason. Why are you being so naive or deceptive?
So one person treats words like code to be cracked, and the other treats words like plain text.
Exactly.
And the more one person tries to crack the code, the more the plain text person feels completely unseen and accused of lying.
The irony is that both people think they are fighting for truth. One is fighting for literal truth. The other is fighting for subtextual truth.
That is wild. So what happens when these incompatible operating systems are forced to share a life? Specifically, what happens when one person has more power in the relationship?
That's where things get really heavy.
Or, what if society dictates that one specific protocol, like highly emotive therapy speak, is the universally correct one?
That is where we enter the territory of the mask. When one person's relational protocol is treated as the universal default, the lower power party, or the person with the socially less favored style, is forced to run a non-native operating system.
And that can't be easy.
It isn't. They have to do it at a substantial, often crushing metabolic cost.
I feel like we need to differentiate this.
Yeah.
Isn't a little bit of masking just the normal compromise required to be a polite adult?
I mean, sure, to a degree.
Like, we all code switch. I don't talk to my boss the same way I talk to my best friend over a beer.
We have to completely separate situational politeness, which is relatively cheap, from the systemic exhaustion of the mask. The mask isn't just polite code switching for an hour at a dinner party.
What is it then?
It is the sustained, system-wide performance of a constitution that does not match your underlying architecture. Your native protocol still exists. Your biological impulses still arise.
But you can't act on them.
Right. They are blocked from reaching your behavior because your fundamental relational architecture is being treated as a defect that must be constantly overridden.
Walk me through what that actually feels like in real time. How does it drain the battery?
The text details a four-part mechanism to this immense metabolic cost. First, there is suppression. You have to actively block your native impulses before they become behavior.
Okay, suppression.
Second is performance. You have to generate the expected counterfeit protocol from scratch. Third is translation, converting your native responses into the required interface in real time.
And the force.
Fourth is monitoring, constant self-surveillance to make sure your mask doesn't slip.
So let me get this straight. Imagine your native protocol is to retreat and process quietly when you're angry.
Very common.
But your partner demands immediate emotion-forward verbal processing because society told them that's healthy. The translation cost means you are sitting on the couch, literally suppressing your biological urge to leave the room, while simultaneously trying to invent words that sound like the healthy communication your partner needs to hear,
Exactly.
while constantly monitoring your tone so they don't think you're being defensive. That real-time translation is what burns you out.
It consumes a massive amount of cognitive capacity that would otherwise be available for living and connecting, which leads to a core takeaway from the text. A communication method that unmasks one person can become another person's mask.
Wow, let me synthesize that because it's vital. You're saying that the very tool one person uses to feel safe and connected is the exact tool draining the other person's energy.
Yes, that completely flips standard relationship advice on its head.
It really does.
What one partner calls healthy communication, say highly explicit emotion-forward processing, might be completely native and regulating to them. It feels like taking off armor.
But for their partner.
Engaging in that exact same healthy communication required them to run a counterfeit operating system to the point of total exhaustion. The first partner feels unmasked and deeply connected. The second partner is running a grueling simulation just to survive the conversation without causing a breach of treaty.
So if the mask is metabolically unsustainable, and our individual implicit creeds will inevitably clash because we're running different code, how do we actually fix the machine?
We have to build a new architecture that sits above both people. The text calls this the shared skeleton.
The shared skeleton. It sounds very structural, very mechanical.
It is entirely structural. It is a bilateral repair. It's an explicit constitution that binds both individual treaties. It does not ask you to eliminate your underlying differences or, change your soul.
Which is a relief.
Right. Instead, it arbitrates between your differences through specific articles that you both agree to honor.
So instead of trying to force a Mac app to run on Windows, you both agree to build an API. Like a translation layer with explicit rules you wrote together, but only for the specific places where you keep crashing.
That's exactly it.
Mm-hmm.
But a useful article in the shared skeleton cannot rely on vague morality. Saying, "We promise to be nicer," is useless.
Back to the endpoint labels.
Exactly. A functional article has to name 4 specific things: the trigger, the expected behavior, the reciprocal obligation, and the test for success.
Let's apply that to one of our specimens. How would you write an article for the validation versus analysis collision?
An article for that collision might look like this. The trigger is defined as one person expressing acute distress.
Okay.
The expected behavior is that the listener provides presence and validation first, without offering solutions.
And the reciprocal obligation.
The reciprocal obligation is that analytical problem solving is only offered after a cooling off period, and the distressed person explicitly agrees to treat that later analysis as an act of care, not as a cold attack.
That's brilliant.
And the test for success is simple. Does the next time distress happens run according to this sequence instead of turning into the old fight?
What I love about this mechanism is that it entirely removes the moral judgment. You aren't asking the other person to care more or suddenly become a different person.
Not at all.
You are just agreeing on a mechanical procedure to run when a very specific trigger fires. It depersonalizes the conflict.
It converts a recurring, unspoken, "of course you should have known," into a testable mechanical article. Though we also need to clarify what the shared skeleton is not. It is not a demand for total explicitness in the relationship.
Right, because sitting down to define every single assumption about who buys the groceries and how we fold towels would be an absolute nightmare.
Completely unlivable. Most of your shared defaults should be left entirely alone because they work silently in the background.
If it ain't broke, don't write an API for it.
Exactly. You only need to excavate the treaty where the same invisible assumption keeps producing injury, confusion, or that exhausting mass cost. Furthermore, it is not literal paperwork.
Good. No notarized contracts needed.
Right. You do not have to print out a contract and sign it. The form is irrelevant. The only test of a successful article is whether the machine runs differently the next time.
Let's summarize this journey for you, the listener, because we have shifted a major paradigm today. We started by throwing out useless endpoint labels, those generic commands like communicate openly that point to a destination without giving us the mechanical path to get there.
We moved away from moral judgments and diagnosed the hidden mechanical collisions of our implicit treaties.
Right.
We saw that what feels like a lack of care or a personal attack is usually just 2 coherent but incompatible constitutions crashing into each other.
And we looked at the systemic cost of the mast. The reality that running a non-native operating system drains our metabolic energy, and that the exact communication style that makes one person feel safe can easily be the thing suffocating the other.
Which is such a profound realization. And finally, we offered a structural repair, the shared skeleton.
A bilateral translation layer made of specific articles to manage recurring collisions.
Right, removing the moral weight and replacing it with a functional mechanism.
This entirely changes how I'm going to look at my next disagreement. And that brings us to our final thought. The source text leaves us with a brilliant aphorism. Every "of course" is a treaty clause.
That's the one to remember.
When you catch yourself thinking, well, of course they should have known to do X, stop and ask yourself, did they violate a universal law of human behavior, or did they just stumble blindly over an invisible clause in your personal treaty?
It forces a necessary humility. You realize your baseline reality is just one specific configuration of code.
It really does. And here is something new to mull over as you go about your day. If our personal relationships are built on these implicit treaties, what happens when we zoom out and apply this to our broader society?
Ooh, that's an interesting thought.
Are the massive cultural, generational, and political divides we see today just macro versions of two different constitutions crashing into each other?
Makes you wonder.
Entire demographics furious with one another, morally condemning each other, with neither side realizing they're just trying to run fundamentally incompatible operating systems on the same hardware. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to start viewing your interactions not as exhausting tests of morality, but as complex mechanisms waiting to be understood and optimized.